Hi YouTube, Melanie here. Today I'll be showing you how to make this pattern, McCall's M7748, and we'll be making View B, which is this one here. This is a really great pattern because it includes an inbuilt petticoat and vintage styling like a gathered bodice and a cupcake skirt, but none of the really hard vintage techniques. You don't need to be an expert to make this dress because I'll be walking you through every single step. So let's get started. The pattern that we're using today is McCall's 7748 View B from the archived collection. This vintage reproduction pattern is from 1957, and here's what you'll need to make this dress. Beware, this dress uses a lot of material. You'll need at least 3.2 meters of dress material with a good amount of drape such as cotton, taffeta, and sateen. This fabric is oriental printed sateen. This dress is fully lined, so you'll need at least 3.6 meters of lining fabric, such as thin cottons and synthetics. I'm using thin poplin. The inbuilt petticoat of this dress requires at least 3.8 meters of netting material. I'm using a soft bridle tulle. You also need 0.8 meters of fusing interfacing. You need matching thread, and you'll need a 40 centimeter invisible zipper and a special foot to sew it with. A hook and an eye. I also suggest getting 2 meters or so of bias binding to neaten the seams on the inside of the dress. And all the usual sewing supplies such as scissors, tailor's chalk, an iron, and an ironing board. I'm also using a few optional extras. To trace off the darts, I'll be using carbon paper and a tracing wheel. I'm also making a toile of the bodice of this dress, which I'm making out of about 1.5 meters of calico fabric. I've also made a separate video to show you how I tailored this dress. Give this video a watch to learn how to make a toile, also known as a mock-up. It will take your garment fitting to the next level. To make this pattern, you'll need to choose your size based on your measurements. Have a look at the sizing chart on the flap of the pattern and choose the size closest to your bust measurement. This dress is fitted in the bust and waist, so size up if your waist measurement is higher than on the reference table. You can't use your normal dress size for these patterns. For View B, you need to cut out pattern pieces 6 to 13. To cut out the pattern, you need to follow the line indicated as your size all the way around the outside of the pattern. Don't cut along the dart markings, which are the triangles on the inside of piece 10 and 12. Let's start cutting out the fabric. Refer to the pattern instructions for the cutting layouts. Choose the layout to follow based on the width of your fabric and your size. I'll be using the first layout for View B because my fabric is 130 centimeters wide and I'm a size 12. Please remember that the shaded pieces on the layout must be placed upside down on the fabric. For the main fabric, you need to cut out pieces 6, 7, and 10 to 13. Lay out your fabric so that the right side is facing up. Grab piece 6 and lay it down on the fabric. We need to align the arrow in the middle of the pattern sheet, called the grain line arrow, with the long edge of the fabric, called the selvage. Now grab your measuring tape and make sure that the grain line arrow is parallel to the selvage by making sure that the length is the same down the entire arrow. Then pin all the way around the pattern. Cut the fabric out by cutting close to the edge of the pattern. The small triangles at the edge of the pattern are called notches. We must mark these onto the fabric by cutting small triangles which go outwards from the edge of the pattern. Move the fabric along and place piece 6 upside down back on top of the fabric. Pin and cut this piece out again. Next, pin piece 12 upside down next to the selvage. Place piece 13 right side up underneath it. Piece 9 needs to be placed diagonal to piece 12. Cut out piece 13. Place piece 13 again in the leftover space and do your best to position this piece parallel to the selvage. Cut out piece 13 and then 9. Repin piece 9 upside down next to piece 12. Cut out the pieces that you've pinned out. Move the fabric down. Pin and cut out piece 13 in the remaining space twice upside down. Pin and cut out piece 10 below. Piece 10 must be cut out once right side up and once upside down. Pin piece 12 right side up next to the bottom selvage. Piece 11 is the most tricky because it needs to be cut on the fold in the middle of the fabric. Fold the remaining fabric down the center. Measure that the fold is parallel to the selvage. Pin the pattern into place. The side of piece 11 with the rectangle needs to be placed directly on top of the fold that you just made. Don't cut along this side when you cut out the pattern. Make sure that there's enough fabric on both sides to cut out the pattern. Lastly, pin and cut out piece 7 twice, upside down, then right side up. Now we're going to cut out the lining. You need to cut out pieces 6, 7, and 10 to 12 in your lining fabric. Fold your fabric in half widthwise. Pin and cut out one each of piece 11 and 12. The rest of the pieces need to be cut on a single layer, so unfold the fabric. Pin and cut the skirt lining pieces in this order: piece 6, piece 7 upside down, piece 6 upside down, then piece 7 right side up. I placed 2 scrap pieces together and then cut out piece 10. You need to cut out 2 copies of piece 10 and 13 in the interfacing. My interfacing is wide, so I can fold it in half and cut both pieces at the same time. If your interfacing is the fusing type, then grab your iron and ironing board. You need to place the side of the interfacing with the glue onto the wrong side of the fabric. press your iron down onto the interfacing until it fuses. Lastly, we'll cut out the petticoat. The petticoat is made of 3 copies of piece 8, which are placed on the fold. The petticoat pieces are placed on the fold parallel to the width of the fabric, not the selvages. Here's how to cut out these pieces. Lay your knitting material on the table. Take the width of the fabric and fold it over far enough for you to lay piece 8 on top. Use some clips to hold the knitting material in place. Lay the side of piece 8 with the rectangle arrow on top of the fold. Pin the pattern into place with pins and clips and cut out. You need to cut out piece 8 2 more times. Place piece 8 on the fold above and to the left of your first cut. Grab piece 9. We need to mark out the 4 small circle markings on this piece. Place a pin next to each of the circle markings. Here's my quick and easy method for transferring markings onto your fabric. Fold the pattern piece on top of the marking. Use some tailor's chalk to make a line from the circle to the raw edge, beside the fold of the pattern. Do this for all 4 circle markings. We'll be making gathering stitches from circle marking to circle marking at the top and bottom edge of this piece. You'll need to make these markings for both of piece 9. To make gathering stitches, you'll need to do the following. Increase your stitch length to the maximum on the straight stitch. Pull out some thread from both the bobbin and the upper spool. When you sew, you must not backstitch and pull out more thread once you're done. Sew from chalk marking to chalk marking at 1 centimeter and 2 centimeters. Make sure that you only sew between the circle markings on the top and bottom edges. Do this for both of piece 9. Next we'll mark the darts on piece 10. Today I'll be showing you how to make darts with dressmaker's carbon paper and a tracing wheel. Lay your carbon paper on the table with the colour side facing up. Place the wrong side of piece 10 on top and the pattern piece on top of the fabric. Pin the pattern to the fabric. Grab your tracing wheel. Choose the line for your size and roll the wheel along the line until you reach the tip. Then turn and roll down the other line. On the other side of your pattern piece, you'll have an identical triangle. These darts are super easy and accurate. Trace the dart marking for both of piece 10. Fold the fabric in half down the center of the dart marking. We need to align the dart marking on both sides of the fold. I suggest adjusting the fabric so that both lines will be pierced by a needle. Pin the dart. Sew down the dart marking with a straight stitch. Do this for both of piece 10. Pin the dart towards the curved edge. Just like with piece 9, we need to mark 4 circle markings on the wrong side of this piece. Grab the pattern and pin it to the fabric next to the circles. Copy the circle markings onto the fabric by folding back the pattern and marking the fabric with tailor's chalk. Piece 9 must now be placed on top of the wrong side of piece 10. Match and pin the corners of these pieces. Use the chalk markings you made to help you align them together. You must now gather the top and bottom edges of piece 9 to match the width of piece 10. Grab one thread from the end of the 2 rows and gently pull as you use the other hand to hold the fabric. The fabric will pull together to create gathers. Once the width matches piece 10, knot together the threads for the 2 rows at both ends. Run your fingers over the top of the gathers to even them out. Repeat for the gathering stitches on the bottom edge. You'll need to gather both of piece 9. Sew around the entire edge of piece 9 and 10 at 1 cm. This will hold the gathers in place until you sew them permanently. Next, we need to prepare piece 11. We'll be sewing the 2 curved edges first, which can be tricky. I suggest sewing around both of the curved edges at 1.3 centimeters. Then cut slits into the seam allowance up to the seam. You must not break your stitching or the fabric may begin to rip. Place piece 11 right side up. Grab piece 9 and 10, which you previously sewed together, and place the right side of piece 9 down on 11. We are sewing these pieces together by the curved edge, so I suggest matching the outer corners first. From this perspective, piece 10 should be upside down. To pin the rest of the curve, I suggest flipping these pieces over. The slits on piece 11 will help you bend this piece to match the curve of piece 9 and 10. Pin the other set of piece 9 and 10 to 11. Sew these pieces together at 1.5 centimeters. Pull out the lower gathering stitches on piece 9 once you're happy with how they look. Trim the seam allowance to about half for the seam you just made. It's also a good idea to cut triangles up to the seam, but make sure you don't cut into the stitching. Zigzag stitch over the top of the raw edge to prevent it from fraying. Once again, I'm using my carbon paper to mark the darts on piece 12. Use the same method. Place the wrong side of the fabric on the coloured side of the carbon paper, then pin the pattern on top. Roll along the dart triangle with your tracing wheel and the marking will transfer onto the fabric. Fold the fabric in half through the dart marking. Use a pin to align the markings. sew down the length of the dart. Iron the darts towards the centre back when you get a chance. Do this for both of piece 12. Piece 12 needs to be attached to the bodice front that you've made so far at the side seam. Match the sides with the double notch and pin these pieces right side together. Pin both of piece 12 to the bodice front. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters. Zigzag stitch each of these raw edges individually and iron them apart. Many of these steps are the same as sewing the main fabric. Mark the dart markings on both of piece 10. Pin and sew these darts. Once again, I'm going to sew around each of the curves of the lining of piece 11. Sew at 1.3 centimeters. Cut slits into the seam allowance of these curves up until the stitching. Lay piece 10 right sides together on top of piece 11. Pin the curves of these pieces together. Do this for both of piece 10. Sew these pieces together at 1.5 centimeters. Once you're done, trim the seam allowances and finish with a zigzag stitch. Next we'll do the darts for piece 12. Trace the darts with carbon paper. Fold in half along the center of the dart and pin. Sew down the dart marking. Do this for both of piece 12. Pin both of piece 12 right sides together to the bodice lining, matching the double notch. Sew these pieces together at 1.5 centimeters. Finish the raw edges individually. Grab the pattern for piece 9 and pin it to the fabric at the top corner. You must now fold the pattern so you can copy the square marking for your size onto the fabric. Remember to make these markings on both sides of the bodice. Pin piece 10 to the top corner of the bodice next to the big circle marking for your size. Fold the pattern along this marking and copy it onto the fabric. This marking represents the end of the seam where the strap is sewn onto the bodice. The lining is ready to be sewn to the bodice. Lay the bodice on top of the bodice lining with right sides together. We need to sew these sections together at the armhole seam, which is the curved edge above the side seam. I suggest aligning the side seam for the bodice and the lining. To do this, you need to measure and mark 1.5 centimeters across the seam to be aligned. Fold along this marking to view where the seam will be sewn. Move the fabric around so that it will align nicely. On your sewing machine, sew over the seam to be aligned at 1.5 centimeters without backstitching. If you're not happy with it, you can easily undo the stitching. Open it up to see how it aligns. pin the rest of the armhole seam. Sew this curve at 1.5 centimeters. Do this for both sides of the bodice. I suggest sewing over the seam again at 1.3 centimeters to reinforce it. Trim the seam allowance to about half. Cut triangles into the seam allowance up until the second seam that you did. Make sure that you don't cut into either of the seams. Do this for both armholes. Finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. Fold out the linings so that both it and the bodice are lying flat on the table. Pin the seam allowance for the armhole seam towards the lining. We now need to understitch the armhole seam to help prevent the lining from showing when you wear it. Understitching involves sewing the seam allowance towards the lining side. Make sure that the seam allowance is facing in the right direction by checking the wrong side. Do this for both armhole seams. On your sewing machine, you must bring the flat seam up to the foot. You must position the bodice underneath the foot so that you are sewing on the lining side with a seam allowance of 5 millimeters from the previous armhole seam. As you sew, check that you're catching the seam allowance of the armhole. Repeat for the other armhole. We'll now prepare the bodice for sewing the straps on top. Fold the lining into place on top of the bodice. The wrong sides should be together. Pin the top raw edges and match the seams for the bodice stay and the corners. I suggest making a marking at the very center of the bodice. Fold the bodice in half and pin the center. Make a chalk marking on top of the pin. Sew over the raw edge of the bodice at about 1.3 centimeters. Make a slit over your marking for the center until you reach the seam you just made. This slit will help you align the straps when you attach them to the bodice. Now we can start sewing the straps. Grab 2 copies of piece 13. Lay the pattern on top of the fabric on the side with a notch. We need to mark the big and small circle markings onto the wrong side of the fabric. Pin beside the 2 circle markings. Mark the circles onto the fabric by folding along the marking and making a line with tailor's chalk beside it. Do this for the second copy of piece 13. Lay a copy of piece 13 with the chalk markings right sides together on top of a copy without the markings. Pin into place. Do this for all 4 copies of piece 13. We need to start sewing on the chalk marking and end sewing on the other. Take these pieces over to your sewing machine and sew between the chalk markings at 1.5 centimeters. Do this for both sets of the straps. Finish the raw edges of the seam individually and iron them apart. Grab the set of straps which you want to show on the outside of the dress. Once again, place the pattern of piece 13 on top of the wrong side of the fabric. You need to copy off the square and big circle marking for your size. Pin the pattern beside these markings, then fold. Use tailor's chalk to mark all 4 markings onto the fabric. On your sewing machine, sew over the marking a few times at 1.3 centimeters. Cut a slit into the seam allowance until you reach your stitching. This seam reinforces the slit so that the fabric won't rip. The slit creates sections to help you sew the strap onto the dress. Set up your iron and ironing board. Fold up the end section created by the square slit by 1.5 centimeters on the wrong side of the fabric. Use your iron to press it into place. Moving on to the center of the strap. Fold up the section at the very center of the strap by 1.5 centimeters and iron. This is the sections between the 2 circle markings. The leftover sections between the circle and the square will be left flat. The sections that we fold up will be sewn onto the dress in the future, but for now we need them out of the way. Lay the 2 sets of straps right sides together. Pin the top edge of the straps together. You must make sure that the end of the center seams align on both sides. Sew the top edge of the straps together at 1.5 centimeters. When you reach the center seam, you must stop and pivot to re-angle the seam. If you've done this right, you'll create a nice V neckline with no gaps. Trim the seam allowance to about half. Cut triangles into the seam allowance up until you're stitching. Do this all the way around the seam. Be careful not to cut into the seam. Also, cut away the excess fabric at the center of the straps and create a wide V. Finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. Once again, we'll be using understitching to create a crisp finish. The understitching needs to be done on the side without the sections cut into it. For me, this is the side with the interfacing, also known as the facing side. Fold out the strap and push the seam allowance towards the facing side. Pin the seam allowance down. Do this for the entire strap top seam. Be sure to check that the seam allowance is being caught by the pins. Back to the sewing machine. Lie the strap flat with the right side facing up. Sew on the facing side with a seam allowance of about 5 mm from the top edge seam. Keep the facing side flat as you sew to create the best look. When you reach the center seam, lift your foot up and pivot to re-angle the seam. time to sew the bottom edge of the strap. Once again, fold the straps down so that they are right sides together. Pin the unfolded sections of the strap to the facing. We need to sew from slit to slit over this section to create the armhole edge of the strap. Sew from slit to slit at 1.5 centimeters. Backstitch strongly on top of the slit as this will be a stress point in the dress. Next, we'll trim the seam that we've sewn. Trim the bottom edge of the strap to about 5 millimeters. Don't cut over the sections that you've folded up. We'll be using them soon. Finish the bottom edge of the strap with a zigzag stitch. Turn the strap right side out. With your iron, press the strap nice and flat. Turn up the raw edge of the side with the zigzag stitching by 5 millimeters. This side will be hand sewn down later, but for now we need it out of the way. Flip out the section which you previously folded inside of the strap. Iron the section straight. Do this for both the end and center sections of the strap. Lay out your bodice with the right sides facing up on the table. Place the side of the strap with the raw edges hanging out on top of the upper edge of the bodice. Align the center front seam for both of the bodice and the strap and pin into place. Pin the ends of the center sections to the corner of the armholes. This is the corner where you will match the big circle marking on these two pieces. Pin the rest of the strap to the bodice. Now for the back sections. Pin the corners for the end sections of the strap to the upper edge of piece 12 on the bodice. Then pin the rest of the strap into place. The right sides must be together. Repeat this process for the other end of the strap. I'm starting sewing at the back section first with the strap side facing up. Sew this section at 1.5 centimeters. When you reach the slit in the strap, sew as close as possible without catching other areas of the strap in your sewing. Start sewing at the center section as close as possible to the slit. When you reach the center seam, make sure that the slit is aligned perfectly. Stop on top of the center seam and pivot the foot so that you can keep sewing the strap at a different angle. Finish this section by sewing as close as possible to the slit. Sew the last back section too by starting close to the slit and sewing to the end of the strap. You can finally pull out the gathering stitches on the bodice. Trim the seam allowance for the seam you just did to about half. Finish the raw edges with a zigzag stitch. On the lining side of the bodice, flatten the strap facing and pin it into place on top of the lining. The raw edge should be folded to the inside of the strap, and the folded edge should cover the seam that you just sewed. I suggest sewing the strap facing down onto the lining using a ladder stitch. This is a nearly invisible hand stitch, which is pretty easy to sew. We'll start sewing at the end of the strap where the facing meets the lining. Thread your needle and knot to make a double thread. Hide your needle into the seam allowance and make a small stitch to tack the stitching into place. To make your first stitch, you need to push the needle into the lining alongside the edge of the facing. Check the right side of the dress to make sure that the needle isn't piercing the front. Pull the needle through. Now we need to make a stitch onto the edge of the strap facing. You need to insert the needle into the edge of the strap facing in the same spot you exited the lining. Make the next stitch into the lining just the same as you did before. Sew until you reach the armhole. Sew the center section of the straps too. Do some extra stitches at the center V to hold it into place. Great, the bodice is all done, so we can work on the skirt. The skirt for this dress is made from 4 panels, 2 of each of piece 6 and 7. Take both of piece 6 and pin them right sides together down the side with the single notch. This will be the center front seam. Sew both of piece 6 together with a 1.5 cm seam allowance. Go ahead and grab piece 7. Both of piece 7 must be pinned to piece 6 down the side with the double notch. Lay piece 7 on top of piece 6 with right sides together and pin. Don't forget to do the other side too. Sew these skirt pieces together at 1.5 centimeters. Finish all the skirt seams that you've done so far with a zigzag stitch. Finish the raw edges for the unsewn side of piece 7 too. To make the centre back seam, we need to sew both of piece 7 together down the side with the triple notch. But we need to leave enough space for the zipper. Lay piece 7 right sides together. Grab the pattern piece for piece 7 and copy the circle markings onto the fabric with tailor's chalk. Pin both of piece 7 together. Sew the centre back seam at 1.5 centimeters. You must now sew from this marking down to the bottom of the skirt. Use your scissors to cut the fabric along the chalk marking up until the stitching. Set up your iron and ironing board. Use your iron to fold up the bottom edge of the skirt by 1.5 centimeters on the wrong side. I'm using a blind hemming stitch to sew the hem down, which creates a perfect seamless look. Firstly, we knot our thread onto the needle and push it through the fabric of a seam. Make a small stitch to take it into place. The first stitch of the blind hem we make is by running the needle through the fold of the hem. You shouldn't be able to see the needle. Pull it through. The next stitch is made on the wrong side of the skirt. With your needle, pick up just a few threads of the fabric very close to the end of the last stitch. Run the needle through the fold of the hem again, entering the fabric close to where you made the stitch on the skirt. Beware that this hem is very long. You can use your sewing machine to sew 1 centimeter from the edge if you don't feel like hand stitching. Keep doing this all the way around the skirt. Then knot off. Sew the skirt lining together just like you did with the main fabric. Pin piece 6 right sides together down the side with the single notch. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters. Place piece 7 on top and pin together down the side with the double notch. Do this for both copies of piece 7. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters. Finish all the raw edges so far. Copy the dot marking on piece 7 onto the side with the triple notch. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters from the dot marking down to the bottom of the skirt. Snip along your chalk marking until you reach the seam line. Finish the raw edge of the bottom of the skirt. With your iron, turn up the bottom edge of the skirt by 3 centimeters on the wrong side. Pin into place. Fold away the raw edge of the hem by 5 millimeters. Take your skirt lining back to your sewing machine. Sew the hem down by about 2 centimeters from the fold. This seam needs to be near where the raw edge is folded away to create a neat look. The knitting material for the petticoat is made from 3 pieces of piece 8. To make the first seam, place 2 of piece 8 right sides together along one of the edges with the notch. Pin these pieces together using clips. Sew these pieces together at 1.5 centimeters. Grab the last of piece 8 and pin it to the petticoat down the side with the notch. Sew together at 1.5 centimeters. We need to sew a gathering stitch at the top edge of the petticoat in order to fit it under the dress. Change your sewing machine settings to the longest stitch length possible and pull out some thread from both the needle and the bobbin. Sew at 1 centimeter all the way around the top edge of the petticoat. You must not backstitch before and after you sew. Pull out some thread once you're done and leave a long tail. Place the raw edges of the sides together to create a loop and pin. This seam also needs to allow space for the zipper, just like the skirt. We need to refer back to the pattern and copy the dot marking onto the fabric. We can't use tailor's chalk on knitting, so I'm going to use tailor's tacks. Pin the pattern to the netting. Thread your needle double with tacking thread if you have it. Make a horizontal then vertical stitch inside the dot marking. Leave a big loop as you do this. Gently lift the pattern off of the fabric and cut the thread in between. Knot the threads in between to create an accurate representation of the dot marking. Pin the rest of the raw edge together. Sew at 1.5 centimeters from your tailor's tack to the bottom of the petticoat. Snip the seam allowance at your tailor's tack and cut it off. Lay out the skirt lining so that the wrong side is facing up. You must now place the petticoat on top so that the wrong sides are together. Start by matching the corners at the centre back seam. Roughly lay the petticoat out on top. Use gathering stitches on the petticoat to adjust the width to match the lining. Grab one of the threads and gently pull it to gather the petticoat. Once you're done, pin the petticoat in place along the top raw edge. Try to make the gathering as even as possible around the width of the petticoat. To hold these pieces together, I suggest sewing together at 5 millimeters. The main skirt must be placed on top of the wrong side of the petticoat. Match the corresponding seams for the lining and the skirt and pin into place. Pin the raw edges together down the centre back seam too. As you pin, make sure that the petticoat is straight and isn't catching in the pins. Sew these 3 layers together at 5 millimeters all the way around the top edge of the skirt. Use your tape measure and tailor's chalk to mark 2.5 centimeters away from the corners of the back seam at the top edge of the skirt. When we sew the gathers onto the skirt, we'll leave these areas flat to help sew the zipper. The skirt is ready to be gathered. This skirt needs to be very heavily gathered, so I suggest dividing each of the skirt panels in half. Fold each of the skirt panels in half and use your tailor's chalk to mark the center. We'll sew gathering stitches just like with the petticoat. Increase your stitch length to the max and don't backstitch. Sew from chalk marking to chalk marking at both 1 centimeter and 2 centimeters. When you sew the next set of gathering stitches, make sure that they overlap with the previous set. Sew the next set at 1.2 centimeters and 2.2 centimeters so that none of the gathering stitches cross over each other. We do this to ensure the gathers are even all the way around the skirt. To gather the skirt, we need to gently pull one thread from each of the row of gathering stitches. The fabric will pull and gather. Pull the threads on both sides of the rows until you can no longer. At this point, knot the threads together to hold the gathers in place. Gather the entire skirt. We can now attach the skirt to the bodice. Lay out the skirt, then place the bodice on top so that the right sides are together. Match the corners and pin. First things first, we need to align the side seams to the skirt and the bodice. Place the two seams to be aligned, facing right sides together. Measure 1.5 centimeters from the raw edge and make a marking. Fold one layer down on this marking so you can view the seam. Move the other layer of fabric so that the seams will align, then pin. Repeat for the other side seam. Sew over the seam at 1.5 centimeters without backstitching to see how well it aligns. Now we need to pin the rest of the skirt to the bodice. You might find that even though you pulled the gathers as much as possible, the skirt is still wider than the bodice. That's okay because you can still jam the gathers together on top of the fabric. Try and push the gathers together as you pin on top and use many pins. Small overlaps will be lost in the gathers. Once you're done, sew the skirt to the bodice at 1 centimeter. This will help compress the gathers at the top. Repin this seam and sew at 1.5 centimeters to make the true seam. As you sew, make sure that the skirt is straight so you don't make any ugly tucks. Use your quick unpick to carefully pull out the gathering stitches. This seam will be visible from the inside of the dress, so I recommend finishing it with some bias binding or extra fabric. Trim the seam allowance for the waist seam to about half. Zigzag stitch over the top. Grab your bias binding, which should be folded in half with the raw edges folded away. You must place the bias binding on top of the fabric so that the raw edge of the waist seam is completely covered. The bias binding should be folded on top. Snip off about 2 centimeters of the bias binding from the end of the waist seam. We do this to prevent the seam from becoming too thick for the zipper to run over. Top stitch over the top of the bias binding by sewing about 5 millimeters from the fold. All I need to do is copy the new seam lines from the toile onto the fabric. Lay out the back of the dress and place the toile on top. Match the raw edges and corners. Pin the toile to the dress near the markings you made to take it in. Fold the toile along the line that you made. Copy this line onto the dress with tailor's chalk. This line is where you need to sew the zipper onto the dress. At this point, you should try the dress on. Measure 1.5 centimeters from the line you just drew on the side facing towards the raw edge. Join the markings that you made to create a line. This is your new seam allowance, so you can go ahead and cut along this line. The dress is all tailored and ready to have the zipper sewn in. see the next video for how I tailored this dress. For now, we'll be using an invisible zipper on this dress. Lay your zipper next to the left side of the opening and pull it open. Take the left side of the zipper and place it down on top of the left side of the dress opening. The edges of the zipper should be facing towards the opening. The left side of the zipper with the head should be facing down onto the right side of the fabric. The zipper needs to be arranged so that the top of the zipper is flush with the top of the dress opening. The teeth of the zipper need to be 1.5 centimeters away from the opening. Pin the zipper into place. Back to the sewing machine. Replace your normal presser foot with an invisible zipper foot. Push the upper thread through the foot and make sure that the needle is in the center position. Sew the zipper tape onto the fabric with a basting stitch to hold it in place. Now we'll be doing the real seam. Position the zipper in the machine so that the top teeth is underneath the left groove of the foot. Start sewing. As you sew, you need to press the teeth of the zipper down on the fabric. This ensures that the zipper is completely covered with fabric when it is sewn. Sew as far down the zipper as possible. Now for the other half of the zipper. For the best look, we need to make sure that the waist seam aligns nicely on both sides of the zipper before sewing it up. Lay the right side of the opening down. Mark 1.5 centimeters from the raw edge with your tailor's chalk. Now fold along the line you just made and pin. Zip up your zipper and lie it flat. Bring the other side of the opening up to the zipper. Press the waistline of the right side of the opening up against the waistline of the left side. Align the waist seam nicely on top of the zipper. We need to pin the right side of the opening on top of the zipper in a way so that we can still pull the head down. I suggest pinning as far away from the teeth as possible but still catching the zipper tape in the pins. Unzip the zipper. Turn the zipper over. You must now carefully rearrange the pins so that they only catch the zipper tape and one layer of the fabric. Move the zipper into the sewing machine so that the teeth are underneath the right groove. Sew down the zipper on top of the waist seam. Zip up the zipper to see how well you've aligned the seam. Pin up the rest of the zipper and position it so that the teeth are 1.5 centimeters away from the raw edge. Zip it up and check how well the seams will align for the straps. Try to arrange the zipper to best align the straps and pin into place just like you did with the waist seam. Check how well you aligned the straps by basting over the top of the zipper. If it looks good, then we can sew the rest of the zipper. This time, place the teeth underneath the left groove and sew from the bottom of the zipper to the top. We need to do just a few finishing touches before this dress will be perfect to wear. I also suggest finishing the zipper seam with bias binding too. Fold the bias binding on top of the raw edge and the zipper tape. Leave some extra bias binding at the top of the zipper. Fold the excess over the end of the zipper and pin. Sew the bias binding in place by sewing at 5mm from the fold. Sew bias binding onto both sides of the zipper tape. You'll need to sew bias binding on the end of the zipper too. Pin the bias binding to the end of the zipper and once again fold some excess bias binding over the corners. Sew that bias binding into place too. You should have a small gap from the end of the zipper and where you finish sewing the skirt. We're going to do a ladder stitch to close this gap. Do the ladder stitch just like you did for sewing down the facing of the straps. Hide the knot of your needle in the seam allowance and make a horizontal stitch. Start the ladder stitch by running your needle into the fold of the fabric for about 4mm. Move to the other side of the seam. Make another stitch starting opposite from where you finished the last stitch. Work your way up the opening until you reach the start of the zipper. Sew a few vertical stitches close to the end of the zipper. Last of all, we'll be sewing a hook and eye to the top of the zipper to make sure that the back doesn't gap open. Lay the dress down so that you can view the zipper and the lining. On top of the left corner, we'll be sewing the eye. Lay the eye out so that the rounded edge is aligned with the edge of the fabric. Push the needle through the seam allowance so that it will pass through one of the small holes of the eye. Pull the needle through. The next stitch needs to pass through the second hole and exit underneath the first. Pass the needle through the first hole again. Keep repeating this process to build up thread on top of the holes, then knot off. Now we'll be sewing the hook. I suggest positioning the hook on top of the eye so you can get a sense of where it needs to be sewn in order to close the gap. Remember that the hook itself must be facing outside the dress so it won't annoy you when you wear it. Sew the hook into place using the same method as sewing the eye. So that's it. Today I've shown you how to make this cute vintage dress. It even has a built-in petticoat. I hope you enjoyed making this dress as much as I did. Show me your photos on Instagram. Next up in our tutorial series, I'll be showing you how to make a McCall's wrap dress, which is very in fashion this summer. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, and check out my other pattern tutorial videos too. See you later! M7748, and we'll be making... Stop distracting me! Today I'll be showing you how to make this cute vintage dress. Inbuilt petticoat.